25 centuries ago, a man, if he even existed, sat down and wrote 81 short passages. No grand treatise, no elaborate system, just verse after verse of quiet, devastating clarity. His name was Lao Tzu, and honestly, we don't know much about him. Some scholars believe he was a real historical figure, an archivist in the Zhou dynasty court. Others argue he's a composite, a legend stitched together from multiple voices across generations. The truth is, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the text he left behind, the Tao Te Ching. It's one of the most translated books in human history, second only to the Bible by some counts. And yet it's barely 5,000 Chinese characters long. You could read it in an afternoon, but you could spend a lifetime trying to absorb it. The book splits into two parts. The first, the Tao Ching, deals with the Tao itself, the way, the fundamental nature of reality that Lao Tzu argues cannot be named, cannot be grasped, cannot be pinned down with language. He opens the entire book with that warning. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Right from the first line, he's telling you, words will fail here, but keep reading anyway. The second part, the Te Ching, shifts to virtue, power. Not power the way we think of it, not dominance. Lao Tzu describes a kind of effortless integrity, a way of moving through the world that doesn't force, doesn't strain, doesn't grab. And that's the architecture. 81 chapters, some only a few lines long, no linear argument, no step-by-step framework. It reads more like poetry than philosophy, and that's deliberate. Lao Tzu wasn't building a system. He was pointing at something that sits underneath all systems. So what does he actually say? What does this ancient text, written for a world that looked nothing like ours, have to offer? Quite a lot, as it turns out. Lao Tzu opens his entire philosophy with a warning. The very first line of the Tao Te Ching says, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao." Right out of the gate, he's telling you, whatever you think you're about to understand, you won't. Not fully. And that's the point. He argues that the ultimate reality, what he calls the Tao, can't be captured in words, can't be pinned down with labels or definitions. The moment you name it, you've already reduced it. You've turned something infinite into something small enough to fit inside language, and language is limited. He draws a distinction here. The nameless, that's the origin of everything. The named, that's how the world of things begins. Categories, labels. This is good, that is bad. That's the world of names. But Lao Tzu says both the named and the nameless come from the same source. They're two sides of one mystery. And the only way to glimpse that mystery, let go of desire. Stop grasping. When you're caught up in wanting, you only see the surface, the 10,000 things. But when you're free from desire, you see what's underneath. The lesson here is almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. Stop trying so hard to define everything. Some truths exist beyond words. In the second verse, Lao Tzu lays out one of his most fundamental ideas. Opposites create each other. Beautiful only exists because ugly exists. Good only makes sense because bad is there to contrast it. Long and short, high and low, before and after. None of these things stand on their own. They depend on each other completely. And this isn't just poetic musing. He's making a sharp philosophical point. The moment you label something good, you've automatically created bad. The moment you chase beauty, you've invented ugliness. Every judgment you make splits the world in two. So what does he suggest? He points to the sage, the wise person, who acts without forcing, teaches without lecturing, and lets things come and go without clinging. The sage does the work, but doesn't take ownership, accomplishes things, but doesn't brag, and because there's no attachment to the outcome, the work endures. This is Lao Tzu's first real lesson on non-attachment. Not apathy, not laziness, but doing what needs to be done, and then releasing it. No scorekeeping, no ego, just action, clean and complete. The key takeaway? Stop splitting the world into rigid categories. The more you label, the more you suffer. Let things be what they are. Lao Tzu makes a bold claim here. He says, stop putting people on pedestals. Stop celebrating some as the best. Because the moment you do that, you create competition. And competition breeds envy, resentment, and disorder. He argues that when you overvalue rare possessions, people start stealing. When you display what's desirable, people's hearts grow restless. So what does the wise leader do? He doesn't fill people's heads with ambition. He fills their bellies. He doesn't sharpen their cleverness. He strengthens their bones. Now, this sounds almost offensive to modern ears. Are we supposed to keep people ignorant? But that's not what Lao Tzu is saying. He's pointing at something deeper. He's warning against a culture that constantly inflames desire. A culture that tells you need more, you need to be more, you need to compete harder. The key lesson here is uncomfortable but honest. When people aren't constantly chasing status and possessions, they settle into a natural peace. They act from contentment, not craving, and a leader who understands this doesn't control through force. He leads by removing the triggers of chaos, not by adding rules, by subtracting noise. Less manipulation, more harmony, not through effort, through restraint. That's the paradox Lao Tzu keeps returning to. Lao Tzu describes the Tao here as something like an empty bowl, used but never filled up, never exhausted. You keep drawing from it, and it never runs dry, bottomless, infinite. And then he says something striking. The Tao blunts what is sharp, unties what is tangled, softens what is blinding, settles what is stirred up. It doesn't impose, it resolves, quietly, without force. He suggests that the Tao seems to have existed before everything, before creation itself, before any god or ancestor. It's that fundamental, that ancient, and yet it's invisible, hidden. You can't point at it, you can't hold it, but it's always there, always working. So what's the lesson for someone just starting with this text? It's this. The most powerful force in existence isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It isn't full of itself. It's empty. And that emptiness is what makes it useful. Think about it. A cup is only useful because it's hollow. A room is only livable because of the space inside it. Lao Tzu is telling us that emptiness isn't weakness. It's capacity. It's potential. The things that seem like nothing, silence, space, stillness, those are the things that hold everything together. This verse hits hard. Lao Tzu says Finn and Earth are not sentimental. They treat all things as straw dogs, ritual objects that were used in ceremonies and then tossed aside without a second thought. No attachment, no favoritism. And the sage? He does the same. He doesn't play favorites with people. He doesn't cling. He lets things rise and fall as they will. Now, this can sound cold, cruel even, but Lao Tzu isn't describing cruelty. He's describing impartiality. Nature doesn't punish you because it's angry. It doesn't reward you because you're special. It just operates, equally, indifferently. And there's a strange kind of fairness in that. He then compares the space between heaven and earth to a bellows, empty inside, but it never stops producing. The more it moves, the more it gives. Emptiness, again, as the source of endless function. And then he drops a sharp line. Too many words lead to exhaustion. Better to hold to the center. That's the real takeaway. Stop overcomplicating things. Stop overthinking. Stop talking so much. The center, that quiet, balanced place inside, that's where clarity lives. Lao Tzu is saying the universe doesn't owe you explanations, and you don't need to generate them either. Just hold steady. Lao Tzu introduces a powerful idea here. He calls it the mysterious feminine, and he links it to something he calls the valley spirit, a spirit that never dies, never fades, it just endures. He says this feminine force is the root of heaven and earth, the gateway through which everything comes into being. It's subtle, barely perceptible, like a thread you can hardly see, but pull on it and it never breaks. Draw from it and it never runs out. Now, Lao Tzu isn't talking about gender here. He's talking about equality, receptivity, openness, the ability to yield and still remain unbroken. In a world obsessed with force, aggression, and dominance, he's pointing to the opposite and calling it the source of all creation. The valley is low. It doesn't climb, it doesn't assert itself, but everything flows into it. Water, life, energy, all of it moves toward the lowest point. And that's exactly Lao Tzu's point. What receives is more powerful than what pushes. The lesson here is quiet but profound. Strength doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like softness. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like surrender. And according to Lao Tzu, that kind of power doesn't just last, it's eternal. Lao Tzu opens this verse with a simple observation. Heaven and earth endure. They've been here long before us. They'll be here long after. And he asks, why? What makes them last? His answer is striking. They endure because they don't live for themselves. They don't cling to their own existence. They don't try to preserve themselves. And precisely because of that, they are preserved. He then turns this idea toward people. The sage, Lao Tzu says, puts himself last and ends up first. He stays behind and ends up ahead. He lets go of himself and finds himself whole. Now, this sounds backward, almost illogical, but that's the point. Lao Tzu is challenging the way most people think about self-interest. We believe that to gain, we must grab. To win, we must push forward. To matter, we must put ourselves at the center. He argues the opposite. The person who stops obsessing over their own survival, their own status, their own gain, that's the person who actually receives the most. Not because they're playing some clever strategy, but because they've removed the very thing that was getting in the way, themselves. The key lesson here? Selflessness isn't weakness. It's the most enduring kind of strength there is. This is one of the most well-known verses in the entire Tao Te Ching, and for good reason. Lao Tzu says, the highest good is like water. Why water? Because water nourishes everything it touches. It gives life to all things, but it doesn't compete. It doesn't fight. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply flows downward to the lowest places, the places nobody else wants to go. And that, Lao Tzu argues, is what brings it closest to the Tao. He then lays out what this looks like in practice. In dwelling, choose humble ground. In thinking, go deep. In relationships, be genuine. In speaking, be honest. In leading, be fair. In working, be competent. In acting, move with the right timing. Notice what's missing from that list. There's no mention of force, no mention of dominance, no mention of outsmarting anyone. Lao Tzu's point is sharp and clear. The person who does not compete has no enemies. The person who flows around obstacles instead of crashing into them gets further every time. Water doesn't try to be powerful, it just is, and over time it carves through stone. That's the lesson. Real strength doesn't announce itself, it moves quietly, and it wins by not fighting at all. Lao Tzu gets blunt here. Fill a cup to the brim, and it spills. Sharpen a blade too much, and it dulls. Hoard wealth and try to guard it, and you'll live in constant anxiety. He's not being poetic for the sake of it. He's warning against excess, against the very human tendency to always want more. More success, more recognition, more control, more of everything. And he says that impulse, it destroys what it's trying to protect. There's a rhythm to things, Lao Tzu argues, a natural point where enough is enough. But most people blow right past it. They get what they wanted, and instead of stopping, they push harder. They climb higher. They accumulate more. And that's exactly when things start to collapse. His advice is direct. Do your work, then step back. Don't cling to the result. Don't attach your identity to your accomplishments. Don't overstay your moment. He calls this the way of heaven. The sun rises, then sets. The seasons shift. Nothing in nature tries to hold its peak forever, and neither should you. The key lesson? Knowing when to stop isn't giving up. It's wisdom. It's the one skill that protects everything you've built from you. Verse 10 of the Tao Te Ching is one of those passages that reads like a challenge. Lao Tzu doesn't lecture here, he asks questions, and every single one of them cuts deep. Can you nurture your spirit and hold to oneness without splitting apart? Can you soften your breath and become as yielding as a newborn? Can you cleanse your inner vision and see clearly without interference? Can you love people and lead them without forcing your will onto them? That last one is where most people fail, because we've been taught that caring means controlling, that leadership means directing every outcome. Lao Tzu disagrees entirely. He introduces what translators often call the primal virtue, or the mysterious virtue. And it comes down to this: produce, but don't possess. Act, but don't expect a reward. Lead, but don't dominate. This is not passivity. That's the common misread. Lao Tzu is describing a kind of strength that doesn't need recognition, a kind of influence that doesn't leave fingerprints. You do what needs to be done, and then you step back. The key lesson? Real mastery isn't about gripping tighter, it's about opening your hands. The moment you stop clinging to results, you actually become more effective, not less. Verse 11 is deceptively simple, and it might be one of the most brilliant observations in the entire book. Lao Tzu uses 3 everyday examples. A wheel, 30 spokes connect to a hub, but it's the empty hole at the center that makes the wheel turn. A clay pot, the walls give it shape, but it's the hollow space inside that makes it useful. A room, you cut doors and windows into walls, but it's the empty space within that you actually live in. His point: what exists gives you benefit, but what does not exist gives you function. Read that again, because it flips everything on its head. We obsess over accumulation, more stuff, more credentials, more noise. But Lao Tzu argues that it's the space between things, the emptiness, that actually makes life work. Without gaps, nothing functions. Without silence, there's no music. Without stillness, there's no movement worth noticing. This isn't abstract philosophy, it's observable reality. A cup filled to the brim is useless. A schedule with no margin leads to collapse. A mind that never rests produces nothing of value. The key lesson here is counterintuitive but undeniable. Emptiness isn't lack, it's capacity. And learning to honor what's absent is just as important as building what's present. Verse 12 is blunt, even by Lao Tzu's standards. The 5 colors blind the eye. The 5 tones deafen the ear. The 5 flavors dull the taste. Racing and hunting drive the mind mad. Rare treasures lead people astray. He's not saying beauty is bad. He's not saying pleasure is wrong. What he is saying, and this is the critical distinction, is that excess destroys the very senses it claims to satisfy. Too much color, and you can't see clearly anymore. Too much noise, and you lose the ability to truly hear. Too much stimulation, and you go numb. Sound familiar? It should. We live in an era of infinite scroll, endless content, and constant sensory bombardment. Lao Tzu wrote this roughly 2,500 years ago, and it's never been more relevant. He then draws a hard line. The wise person, he says, is guided by the belly, not by the eye, meaning they choose inner substance over external spectacle. They nourish what's real inside, rather than chasing what glitters outside. The key lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. The more you chase sensation, the less you actually feel. Lao Tzu isn't asking you to live in a cave. He's asking you to notice when enough became too much, and most people never do. Lao Tzu opens this verse with a line that stops most people cold. He says, favor and disgrace are both things to be feared, and that the greatest misfortune is having a body, having a self. What does he mean by that? He's pointing at something most of us never question. We chase approval, we run from rejection. But Lao Tzu argues that both reactions come from the same place, an obsessive attachment to the self. When you get praised, you're terrified of losing that praise. When you're shamed, you're desperate to escape it. Either way, you're trapped. And then he goes deeper. He says the reason we suffer at all is because we identify so heavily with this self, this body, this reputation, this name. If you didn't cling to a fixed idea of who you are, what could the world actually do to you? What insult could land? What flattery could seduce you? He's not saying you should hate yourself or neglect your body. That's not the point. He's saying, stop making your ego the center of everything. The person who can care for the world the way they care for themselves, without selfish attachment, that's the person fit to lead. That's the person worthy of trust, not the one chasing applause, not the one running from blame. Lao Tzu tries to describe the Tao here, and he essentially tells you, you can't, not really. He says you look for it, but you can't see it. You listen for it, but you can't hear it. You reach for it, but you can't grasp it. He gives these 3 qualities names: invisible, inaudible, intangible. And then he says all 3 merge into one thing, undefinable, beyond the senses. This is Lao Tzu being brutally clear about the limits of human perception. We want to categorize everything, name it, pin it down, but the Tao refuses that. It has no shape, no sound, no form. It's not bright above and not dark below. It moves continuously, and yet it can't be named. It returns to nothingness. He calls it the form of the formless, the image of the imageless. And that's not poetic decoration. That's the whole point. The deepest reality doesn't announce itself. You won't find it through analysis or argument. But here's what matters for your life. Lao Tzu says that by holding to this ancient Tao, by aligning with it, you can navigate the present. You don't need to fully understand it. You just need to stop demanding that everything be explainable. Some things are known only through surrender. In this verse, Lao Tzu paints a portrait, not of the Tao itself, but of the people who actually lived by it, the ancient masters. And the way he describes them is striking. He says they were careful, like someone crossing a frozen river in winter, alert, like someone aware of danger on all sides, courteous, like a guest, never imposing, never overstepping, yielding, like ice about to melt, simple, like uncarved wood, hollow, like a cave, and opaque, like muddy water. Every single one of those points to the same thing: restraint. Lao Tzu argues that the ones who truly understood the Tao didn't broadcast it. They didn't rush. They didn't force. They moved through the world with a kind of quiet reverence, not because they were weak, because they were deep. And that last metaphor, muddy water, he lingers on it. He asks, who can wait quietly while the mud settles? Who can remain still until the right moment to act? That's the real discipline, not action, patience. Lao Tzu's point here is plain. Mastery doesn't look like mastery. It looks like stillness. It looks like humility. The ones who knew the most said the least, and the ones who moved the best barely moved at all. Lao Tzu opens this verse with a command: empty yourself, be still, and then watch. He says everything in nature rises, flourishes, and then returns to its source. Every single thing. The flower blooms and wilts. The wave swells and recedes. Life pushes outward and then pulls back inward. This isn't tragedy. This is the pattern. Lao Tzu calls it returning to the root. And here's where it gets important. He argues that understanding this cycle, truly understanding it, is wisdom. He calls it knowing constancy, the unchanging law beneath all the changing things. But if you don't see this, if you fight the cycle, cling to what's rising, and panic when it falls, Lao Tzu warns that you'll act recklessly. You'll make desperate moves. You'll exhaust yourself trying to hold on to things that were never meant to stay. He's not being pessimistic. He's being precise. Things come and go. That's not a flaw in the system. That is the system. And the person who accepts this, Lao Tzu says, they become tolerant, open, impartial, not because they've given up, but because they've stopped fighting reality. They move with life instead of against it. That, he argues, is what connects a person to the Tao itself. Lao Tzu lays out a hierarchy of leadership here, and it's blunt. The greatest leader? People barely know they exist. The next best? People love and praise them. After that, people fear them. And the worst kind? People despise them. Now sit with that first one for a moment. The best leader is almost invisible. That sounds strange. We're trained to admire loud, commanding, charismatic figures, people who take charge, take credit, take the spotlight. But Lao Tzu sees it differently. He argues that a truly great leader creates conditions where things work naturally. They don't micromanage. They don't demand loyalty. They don't need applause. They guide so subtly that people feel empowered, not controlled. And here's the line that says it all. When the work is done, the people say, "We did it ourselves." That's not failure of leadership. That's the highest form of it. Lao Tzu is pointing at something uncomfortable: the need to be seen, to be credited, to be recognized as the one in charge. That's ego. And ego, he warns, corrupts leadership. It shifts the focus from serving others to serving yourself. Real authority, he suggests, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It works quietly, and the results speak louder than any title ever could. This verse is one of Lao Tzu's sharpest observations, and it cuts deep. He says, when the great Tao is forgotten, that's when kindness and morality appear. When wisdom and cleverness arise, great hypocrisy follows. When families fall apart, filial piety gets praised. When nations plunge into chaos, loyal ministers are celebrated. He's not saying kindness or loyalty are bad. He's saying something far more unsettling. These virtues only get named, only get put on a pedestal, when the thing they represent has already broken down. Think about it. You don't talk about honesty in a culture where everyone's already honest. You don't celebrate loyalty unless betrayal is common. The label only shows up when the reality disappears. Lao Tzu is arguing that the moment we need rules about goodness, codes, doctrines, moral systems, we've already lost the natural goodness that needed no rules in the first place. It's a brutal point. Society doesn't create virtue by naming it. It reveals its own decay by needing to. The Tao doesn't require a billboard. It doesn't need commandments. When people live in harmony with it, these labels are unnecessary. And when those labels start appearing everywhere, Lao Tzu says that's not progress, that's a warning sign. Lao Tzu makes a radical demand here. Drop the pretense, all of it. He says, abandon holiness, abandon wisdom, abandon morality and righteousness, abandon cleverness and profit. And he argues that when you do, people will actually be better off, 100-fold better. Now that sounds dangerous, almost reckless, but here's what he's really getting at. Lao Tzu isn't against goodness. He's against the performance of goodness. He's against systems that label things as moral or righteous, because the moment you create those labels, you also create their opposites. You create guilt, you create hypocrisy, you create people who follow rules not because they feel it, but because they're told to. And that's not real virtue. That's obedience wearing a mask. He points out that when society stops forcing artificial standards onto people, something interesting happens. People return to their natural state, which he believes is genuinely kind, genuinely simple, genuinely caring. His prescription is blunt: embrace plainness, reduce selfishness, have few desires. The key lesson? Lao Tzu argues that humanity doesn't need more rules, more doctrines, more moral instruction. It needs less. Strip away the constructed layers, and what remains underneath is something far more honest than anything a system could produce. Goodness doesn't need a label to exist. This is one of the most personal verses in the entire text, and one of the loneliest. Lao Tzu draws a sharp contrast between himself and everyone else. Other people are bright, confident, sure of themselves. They celebrate, they feast, they know exactly what they want and they chase it. But Lao Tzu, he describes himself as dull, muddled, drifting, like a man with no home. He's not being self-pitying. He's being honest about what it costs to see the world differently. He warns that the person who follows the Tao will often look foolish to others. Everyone else seems so sharp, so clear. And the one who walks this path, They appear confused, out of step, maybe even lost. But here's the turn. Lao Tzu says he is different from ordinary people because he values being nourished by the mother, the Tao itself. That's his anchor. Not status, not cleverness, not the approval of the crowd. The key lesson is uncomfortable but important. Walking a path of depth and stillness will not make you popular. It will make you look strange. Lao Tzu doesn't sugarcoat that, but he also makes it clear what sustains him goes deeper than anything the world offers, and that trade-off, to him, is worth every ounce of loneliness. Lao Tzu tries to describe the indescribable here, and he knows it. He says the greatest virtue, true virtue, follows the Tao entirely. But the Tao itself, it's elusive, intangible. You can't pin it down. You can't hold it in your hands. And yet, within this vague, shadowy, formless thing, there is image, there is substance, there is essence. He's saying the Tao isn't empty in the way we think of emptiness. It's full, impossibly full, but not in any way the mind can easily grasp. He points out that within the Tao, there is something real, something trustworthy. From the very beginning until now, its name has never been lost. It's how all things began. So how does he know about the origin of all things? Through the Tao itself. The key lesson here is foundational. Lao Tzu argues that reality isn't limited to what you can see and touch. The most real thing in existence, the source of everything, is something you'll never be able to capture with logic or language. But it's there. It's always been there. And the fact that you can't define it doesn't make it less real. It makes it more real than anything you can define. Verse 22 is one of the most counterintuitive chapters in the entire Tao Te Ching, and that's exactly why it matters. Lao Tzu argues that the way to become whole is to let yourself be broken. The way to become straight is to let yourself be bent. The way to become full is to let yourself be empty. Want to be renewed? Let yourself be worn out first. This isn't poetic nonsense. He's pointing at something real. The people who cling to being right all the time, they shatter. The people who refuse to bend, they snap. But the ones who yield, who allow life to press against them without resisting every force, they're the ones still standing when the dust settles. And then Lao Tzu takes it further. He says the sage doesn't put himself on display, doesn't try to shine, doesn't argue his case, doesn't boast. And precisely because of that, people notice him, people trust him. No one competes with him because he's not competing with anyone. That's the paradox at the heart of this verse. Stop trying to prove you're enough, and you become more than enough. Stop fighting for attention, and attention finds you. He's not asking you to be weak. He's showing you what real strength looks like. Verse 23 is short, almost blunt, and it hits like a stone dropped in still water. Lao Tzu opens with a simple observation. A whirlwind doesn't blow all morning. A rainstorm doesn't last all day. And who creates the wind and rain? Heaven and earth. So if even heaven and earth can't sustain their outbursts forever, why do you think you can? He's talking about force, about excess, about people who talk too much, push too hard, try to control every outcome. That kind of energy doesn't hold. It burns out, always. And then he draws a quiet line. He says, if you align yourself with the Tao receives you. If you align yourself with virtue receives you. But if you align yourself with loss is what you'll get. This isn't mystical rambling. Lao Tzu is making a deeply practical point. What you give your energy to shapes what comes back to you, not as some cosmic reward system, but because your actions set the direction of your life. He warns against trying to be a hurricane. Speak less, force less. Let your words be sparse and your actions natural. The storm always passes. What remains is what was rooted.
Verse 24 is Lao Tzu at his most direct. No metaphors to decode here. He just tells you what doesn't work. He says, "A man who stands on tiptoes can't stand firm. A man who strides forward aggressively can't walk for long. A man who displays himself doesn't truly shine. A man who promotes himself gains no real credit. A man who boasts achieves nothing lasting. A man who is arrogant won't endure." Read that list again. Every single one of those behaviors is about trying too hard to be seen, trying to appear larger, faster, brighter, more important than you actually are. And Lao Tzu calls all of it excess, leftover food, unnecessary baggage. He says those who follow the Tao want nothing to do with it, not because it's immoral, but because it's wasteful. It drains you. It repels the very thing you're chasing. This verse is a mirror, and an uncomfortable one, because most people, at some point, have stood on their tiptoes, puffed themselves up, tried to look taller than they are. Lao Tzu isn't shaming anyone here. He's pointing out a pattern. The harder you perform your worth, the less people believe it. Real substance doesn't announce itself. It just stands there, flat-footed, unmoved. In verse 25, Lao Tzu does something bold. He tries to describe what existed before everything else, before heaven, before earth, before any of it. He says there was something, formless, complete, silent, vast. It stood alone. It didn't change. It moved in endless cycles without ever wearing out, and he calls it the mother of all things. But here's where he gets honest. He admits he doesn't even know its real name, so he gives it a placeholder, Tao, and if forced to describe it further, he calls it great. Great meaning it flows outward endlessly, it stretches beyond reach, and then it returns. He lays out a hierarchy here that's central to his entire philosophy. There are 4 great things in existence: the Tao, heaven, earth, and humanity. And they follow a chain. Humanity follows earth. Earth follows heaven. Heaven follows the Tao. And the Tao, it follows its own nature. Nothing above it, nothing commanding it. It simply is what it is. Lao Tzu's point is direct. You are not the center of the universe. You are part of a much larger order, and the wisest thing you can do is align yourself with that order, not fight against it. The lesson? Know your place in the vastness and respect it. Verse 26 is short, but heavy, literally. Lao Tzu argues that heaviness is the root of lightness. Stillness is the master of restlessness. That's it. That's the foundation of this entire verse. And he means it in every sense. A tree stands tall because its roots go deep. A person who carries weight, discipline, gravity, substance, doesn't get knocked around by every passing wind. But someone who's light, flighty, reactive, they're at the mercy of everything. He warns that even a ruler with 10,000 chariots, someone with enormous power, can lose everything by acting carelessly, by being restless, by treating serious matters lightly. Lightness loses the root. Restlessness loses control. This isn't about being stiff or joyless. Lao Tzu is making a case for composure, for groundedness.
The sage, he says, travels all day but never strays from the heavy supply cart, surrounded by beauty and spectacle, and yet stays centered, unmoved, not because they don't notice, but because they don't get swept away. And that's the real skill, staying anchored when everything around you is pulling you in different directions. The key lesson? Don't be easily moved. Depth beats speed. Stillness beats chaos. The person with roots will always outlast the one without them. Verse 27 is about mastery, but not the kind most people think of. Lao Tzu describes a good traveler, one who leaves no tracks, a good speaker, one who makes no slips, a good counter, one who needs no tally, a good door, one that needs no lock, yet nobody can open it, a good knot, one tied without rope, yet nobody can undo it. What's he really saying? True skill doesn't look like effort. It doesn't announce itself. There are no marks, no traces, no show. The master makes it look like nothing happened at all, and that's precisely what makes it masterful. But then he goes deeper.
The sage, he says, is always good at saving people. No one is rejected. Always good at saving things. Nothing is wasted. He calls this following the light.
And here's the part that stings. He says the good person is the teacher of the bad, and the bad person, they're the lesson for the good. But if you don't value the teacher, or don't learn from the lesson, you're lost, no matter how clever you think you are. Lao Tzu's message is clear. Mastery is invisible, and everyone, absolutely everyone, has something to teach you. Refuse that, and you've already failed.
Lao Tzu lays out a pattern here that's almost paradoxical. Know the masculine, but keep to the feminine. Know the bright, but keep to the dark. Know honor, but keep to humility. Every time he's saying the same thing. Know strength, but choose softness. He calls this returning to the uncarved block, and that image matters. An uncarved block of wood hasn't been shaped into anything yet. It holds every possibility. The moment you carve it, you limit it. You make it one thing, and it can never be anything else again. Lao Tzu argues that the sage understands this. He doesn't rush to define himself, doesn't cling to labels, doesn't chase the loud, the visible, the prestigious. He stays with what's raw, unpolished, whole. And here's the deeper cut. When the uncarved block is finally carved, it becomes tools. Useful, yes, but fragmented, broken apart. Lao Tzu is warning us. The world will try to carve you. It'll want to shape you into something specific, something useful to it. But the cost is your wholeness. The lesson? Don't be so eager to become something. Stay open, stay flexible. The most powerful version of you isn't the finished product. It's the one that hasn't been carved yet. Lao Tzu makes a statement here that most ambitious people don't want to hear. You cannot improve the world by force. You cannot seize it. You cannot engineer it into perfection. The world, he says, is a sacred vessel, and those who tamper with it ruin it. Those who try to grip it lose it. He's not saying don't act. He's saying don't force. There's a difference, a big one. He then points to the natural rhythm of things. Some lead, some follow. Some breathe hot, some breathe cold. Some are strong, some are weak. Some rise, some fall. Life is a constant movement of opposites. And trying to freeze that movement, trying to make everything one way, that's where destruction begins. So what does the sage do?
He avoids extremes. He avoids excess. He avoids arrogance. He moves with the current instead of trying to redirect the entire river. The key lesson here is blunt. Control is an illusion, and the harder you chase it, the more chaos you create. Lao Tzu isn't telling you to be passive. He's telling you to stop forcing outcomes. Let things unfold. Work with reality, not against it. Because the moment you declare war on the natural order of things, you've already lost. Lao Tzu gets direct here. He says, "Whoever uses the Tao to advise a ruler will warn against using military force to dominate." Why? Because force always comes back around. Where armies march, thorns and brambles grow. After every great war, hardship follows. Famine, ruin, suffering that outlasts the victory. A good leader, Lao Tzu argues, achieves what's necessary and stops, doesn't press further, doesn't boast, doesn't glorify the conquest, doesn't use the win as a platform for more aggression. He gets the results and pulls back, not out of weakness, out of wisdom. And then comes the sharp truth. Whatever relies on force will grow old quickly. It will decay, it will collapse, because force is against the Tao, and anything that goes against the Tao doesn't last. This isn't just about war. Lao Tzu is speaking to a much wider pattern. Every time you force a relationship, it breaks. Every time you force a result at work, there's blowback. Every time you overpower instead of persuade, you plant thorns in your own path. The lesson is clear. Strength exercised without restraint isn't strength, it's recklessness. And recklessness has a short shelf life. Real power knows when to stop. That's what separates a leader from a tyrant. Lao Tzu does not mince words here. Weapons, he says, are instruments of fear, tools of destruction, and any person of true virtue avoids them, unless there is absolutely no other choice. He draws a sharp line. The person who follows the Tao values peace. The person who follows war values conquest, and these two paths don't lead to the same place. But here's where Lao Tzu goes deeper. He says even when war is necessary, even when conflict can't be avoided, it should never be celebrated. Victory in battle is not glory, it's grief. He argues that the one who takes pleasure in killing people cannot find fulfillment in this world, period. And the way he frames it is sobering. He says a victory should be treated like a funeral, not with parades, not with pride. With mourning, because something was lost, lives were lost, and no strategic gain changes that. Lao Tzu isn't being naive about the realities of conflict. He's being brutally honest about what it costs. War may sometimes be unavoidable, but the moment someone starts enjoying it, the moment it becomes a source of identity or pride, something essential in that person has already died. The lesson? True strength grieves the battles it's forced to fight. Lao Tzu returns to a core idea here. The Tao is nameless. It can't be labeled, it can't be boxed in, it can't be owned or categorized or turned into a system. And though it seems small, insignificant even, nothing in the world can master it. He says if rulers could simply align themselves with it, all things would fall into harmony on their own. People wouldn't need to be forced or controlled. Order would arise naturally, like rain falling from the sky. No one commands it, but it nourishes everything equally. But then Lao Tzu makes an important turn. He says the moment you start naming things, dividing, categorizing, creating labels, you need to know when to stop. Because naming is the beginning of separation, and separation is the beginning of losing the whole. This is a direct challenge to the way most people operate. We want to define everything, control everything, put everything in its proper place. And Lao Tzu says that very impulse, taken too far, pulls you away from the truth of how things actually work. The Tao doesn't need a name to function. It doesn't need a title to hold power. The key lesson: the things that matter most can't be contained by language. Stop trying to label everything. Start learning to feel it instead.
This verse hits hard, and it's deceptively simple. Lao Tzu lays out a series of comparisons, and each one cuts straight to the bone. Knowing others, he says, is intelligence, but knowing yourself, that's wisdom. There's a difference, a big one. You can study people your whole life and still be blind to your own patterns, your own delusions, your own blind spots. Mastering others is strength, but mastering yourself, that's real power. Anyone can dominate someone weaker. That takes force. But controlling your own impulses, your own ego, your own reactions, that takes something force can never give you. He goes on, the one who knows he has enough is rich, not the one with the most, the one who's satisfied. And the one who perseveres, who keeps going despite everything, that person has true will. Then Lao Tzu closes with something heavier. He says, the one who does not lose his center endures, and the one who dies but is not forgotten, that person truly lives. This isn't philosophy for the classroom, it's a mirror. Lao Tzu is saying, stop measuring yourself against other people. The only opponent that matters is the one staring back at you. The key lesson? The hardest battle you'll ever fight isn't out there, it's in here. Verse 34 is about the nature of the Tao itself, and Lao Tzu paints a striking picture. The Tao flows everywhere, left, right, in every direction. All things depend on it for life, and it doesn't turn any of them away. It does its work. It accomplishes what needs to be done, but here's what sets it apart. It never claims ownership. It never demands credit. Lao Tzu says the Tao nourishes all things, yet it doesn't act as their master. It has no ambition, no desire to dominate. And because it never tries to be great, that's exactly what makes it great. There's a quiet power in that idea. Most people announce their importance. They position themselves. They brand themselves. Lao Tzu looks at the force that sustains all of existence and points out it does none of that. He's holding up a mirror, not just to individuals, but to how we define greatness altogether. We reward the loud, the visible, the self-promoting. But Lao Tzu argues that the truest form of greatness operates without a signature. It gives without keeping score. The key lesson? If you have to tell people you're great, you're not. Real influence doesn't need a label. It just does what it does. Quietly, completely. Verse 35 is subtle, easy to rush past, but it carries real weight if you slow down with it. Lao Tzu says, hold fast to the great image, and the whole world will come to you. It will come and suffer no harm, only peace and quiet and calm. The great image here is the Tao itself, not a picture, not a concept you frame on a wall. It's the underlying pattern of reality, and Lao Tzu's claim is bold. Align yourself with it, and things naturally fall into place. Not through force, not through strategy, through alignment. But then he adds something interesting. He says the Tao is bland, tasteless. You look for it and can't see it. Listen for it and can't hear it. Yet, and this is the turn, you use it and it can never be exhausted.
That's the paradox. The most powerful thing in existence has no flavor, no spectacle, no drama. It doesn't attract attention the way the world trains us to seek it, but its usefulness is infinite. The key lesson here is a direct challenge to how we value things. We're drawn to what's flashy, what stimulates, what entertains. Lao Tzu says the most inexhaustible resource you'll ever encounter is the one you can't even perceive with your senses, and most people walk right past it. Verse 36 is one of the most cunning passages in the entire Tao Te Ching, and it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Lao Tzu lays out a pattern. If you want to shrink something, you must first let it expand. If you want to weaken something, you must first let it grow strong. If you want to take something away, you must first let it be given. This, he says, is called subtle illumination. On the surface, it sounds manipulative, but that's not what Lao Tzu is doing here. He's describing how reality actually works. Things naturally move toward their opposite. What expands eventually contracts. What rises eventually falls. That's not a trick, it's a law. And then he delivers the punchline. The soft and the weak overcome the hard and the strong. Not sometimes, as a principle. Water wears down rock. Rigidity breaks. Flexibility endures. He closes with a sharp warning. A fish shouldn't leave the deep water, and a nation's sharpest weapons should not be displayed. Meaning, real power stays hidden. The moment you show your full hand, you've already lost your advantage. The key lesson? Don't resist the natural cycle of things. What looks like strength is often the beginning of decline, and what appears weak, patience, softness, restraint, is often what wins in the end. This verse is where Lao Tzu lays down one of his most radical claims. The Tao never acts, and yet everything gets done. Not some things, everything. That sounds like a contradiction, but Lao Tzu is making a precise point here. The Tao doesn't force outcomes. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't manage. And still, seasons change, rivers flow, life renews itself. Without a plan, without ambition, without effort, things simply unfold as they should. And then he directs this at rulers. He says if leaders could hold to this principle, all things would transform on their own. No micromanaging, no excessive laws, no heavy hand, just alignment with the natural order, and people would settle into place by themselves. But he warns, desire will arise. Even in the midst of stillness, craving creeps in, and when it does, Lao Tzu says you subdue it with what he calls the nameless simplicity, that uncarved, raw, undecorated state. No labels, no ambition, no agenda. Here's the key lesson. Most people believe that more action means more results. Lao Tzu argues the exact opposite. The deepest form of power doesn't push, it doesn't chase, it holds still and lets things come to it. That's not laziness, that's trust in the process itself. This is one of the sharpest verses in the entire book. Lao Tzu draws a hard line here. He says, true virtue doesn't know it's virtuous, and that's exactly what makes it real. A person of high virtue doesn't try to be good, they just are. There's no performance, no self-awareness about their own goodness. But a person of low virtue, they cling to the appearance of virtue. They work hard at being seen as moral. And because of that effort, Lao Tzu says, they miss it entirely. Then he lays out a hierarchy, and it's devastating. He says, when the Tao is lost, virtue appears. When virtue is lost, benevolence appears. When benevolence is lost, righteousness appears. When righteousness is lost, ritual appears. And ritual, he calls it the thinnest husk of loyalty and faith, the beginning of chaos. Read that again. He's saying every layer of moral structure we build is actually a sign of decline. Rules exist because people stopped being natural. Rituals exist because sincerity disappeared. The more codes and conduct a society needs, the further it's drifted from the Tao. Lao Tzu's message here isn't anti-morality. It's deeper than that. He's saying when goodness has to be enforced, it's already gone. Real virtue doesn't need a name. It doesn't need a system. It just moves. Lao Tzu talks about the One in this verse, and by the One, he means the Tao, the source, the origin, the root of everything that exists. He lists it out plainly. Heaven gained the One and became clear. Earth gained the One and became stable. Spirits gained the One and became powerful. Valleys gained the One and became full. All living things gained the One and came to life. Rulers gained the One and brought order. Everything traces back to this single source. And then he flips it. Without the One, heaven would crack, earth would quake, spirits would fade, valleys would dry up, life would end, rulers would fall. Nothing sustains itself alone. Nothing. But here's where Lao Tzu sharpens the blade. He points out that wise rulers used to call themselves orphaned, desolate, worthless, not out of false modesty, because they understood something essential. The high is built on the low. The noble is rooted in the humble. You can't have a peak without a foundation. So the lesson is this. Greatness doesn't come from elevating yourself. It comes from staying connected to the source. The moment you forget where your power comes from, the moment you lose that root, everything above it crumbles. Oneness isn't abstract philosophy, it's structural. Lose it, and the whole thing collapses. This is one of the shortest verses in the entire Tao Te Ching, but don't let the brevity fool you. It carries enormous weight. Lao Tzu makes two statements here. First, returning is the movement of the Tao. Second, weakness is the way of the Tao. That's it. 2 lines, and they flip everything upside down. He's saying the Tao doesn't push forward endlessly. It cycles back. It returns. Everything that moves outward eventually comes home. Growth leads to decay. Expansion leads to contraction. The out-breath follows the in-breath. The Tao moves by reversing, not by conquering. And the second part? The Tao operates through yielding, through softness, not through force, not through domination. Water doesn't smash through rock by being harder than rock. It wears it down by being softer, consistently, patiently. Lao Tzu then adds something that stops you in your tracks. He says all things comes from being, but being itself comes from non-being, from nothing. That's not wordplay. He's pointing at something foundational. Everything that exists emerged from what didn't exist. The visible world is born from the invisible. The tangible grows out of the intangible. So the root of all creation, it's not something solid, it's emptiness. And that emptiness isn't absence, it's the source. Lao Tzu draws a sharp line between 3 kinds of people in this verse, and it's revealing. When a wise person hears about the Tao, they practice it immediately, diligently, without hesitation. When an average person hears about it, they half believe it and half doubt it. They're interested but uncommitted. And when a foolish person hears about it, they laugh out loud. And here's the part that hits. Lao Tzu says if the foolish didn't laugh at it, it wouldn't be the Tao.
He's not insulting anyone. He's making a structural point. The Tao sounds absurd to conventional thinking. It has to, because conventional thinking is built on the exact opposite: striving, accumulating, dominating. The Tao says, yield, be empty, let go.
Of course, that sounds ridiculous to someone whose entire worldview depends on grasping. Then Lao Tzu stacks paradox on paradox. The brightest path looks dark. The way forward looks like retreat. The smoothest path feels rough. True power looks like weakness. True purity looks tarnished. He's not being poetic for the sake of it. He's warning you. The Tao will never look like what you expect. It won't match your assumptions. And if you wait for it to make sense to your ego, you'll be waiting forever. The truth doesn't dress up for approval. This verse contains one of the most famous passages in all of Eastern philosophy, and Lao Tzu wastes no words. The Tao gives birth to one. One gives birth to two. Two gives birth to three. Three gives birth to the 10,000 things. He's laying out a cosmology, not with equations or diagrams, but with a sequence. Everything traces back to a single origin. The Tao. From it, unity emerged. From unity, duality, yin and yang. From duality, a third force. And from that, everything else. All of existence. Every form, creature, system, and element. But Lao Tzu doesn't stop there. He says all things carry yin on their back and hold yang in their embrace. They find harmony by blending these forces together. Opposition isn't a problem, it's the very mechanism of creation. Then he shifts. He points out that people hate being called orphaned, lonely, or worthless. But wise rulers use exactly these titles for themselves. Why? Because Lao Tzu argues that what diminishes you actually strengthens you, and what elevates you can quietly destroy you. Loss becomes gain. Gain becomes loss. He's not being paradoxical just to provoke. He's describing how reality actually works. The person who embraces lowliness stands on the firmest ground. The one who chases height has the farthest to fall. Lao Tzu makes one of his most powerful arguments here, and it's deceptively simple. He says the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest. Water cuts through rock, not with force, not with speed, with persistence, with yielding. He points out that what has no substance can enter where there is no space. Think about that. The formless penetrates the impenetrable. Air moves through walls, water seeps into the smallest crack. What seems like nothing gets everywhere. And from this, Lao Tzu draws a lesson that most people will resist. He argues that non-action, doing without forcing, is one of the most powerful approaches in existence, and teaching without words, one of the rarest. He's not saying do nothing. He's saying stop forcing. Stop pushing against things with brute effort and sheer will. Because the things that look weak, patience, softness, silence, they outlast everything that looks strong. The key lesson here cuts against every instinct we've been trained to follow. We're taught that power means hardness, that strength means aggression. Lao Tzu says the opposite. He argues that the yielding overcomes the rigid. Every time. But, and he's honest about this, very few people in the world are actually willing to live this way. Knowing it is easy. Practicing it is another thing entirely. Lao Tzu asks 3 questions in this verse, and none of them are casual. Which matters more, your name or your life? Which is worth more, your life or your possessions? Which brings greater pain, gaining or losing? He's not being philosophical for the sake of it. He's drawing a line, and the line is this: the more you cling, the more you lose. He warns that whoever loves deeply will spend greatly. Whoever hoards much will suffer heavy loss. People chase reputation until it consumes them. They accumulate wealth until it owns them. And they grip so tightly to what they have that losing even a small piece of it feels like death. But Lao Tzu flips it. He argues that the person who knows when enough is enough will never be disgraced. The person who knows when to stop will never be in danger. That word, enough, it's the entire verse in a single word. The key lesson? Lao Tzu isn't telling you to abandon ambition or reject material life. He's telling you to examine your attachments. Hard. Because the things you think are adding to your life might be the very things draining it. And the moment you attach your identity to what you own or what people call you, you've already lost something far more valuable. Lao Tzu warns you here. Things are not what they appear to be. He says true perfection seems flawed, but its usefulness never runs out. True fullness seems empty, but its capacity is infinite. True straightness seems bent. True skill seems clumsy. True eloquence seems like stammering. He's making a point that most people miss entirely. The things that look polished, finished, complete on the surface, those aren't the real thing. Real mastery doesn't announce itself. Real depth doesn't perform for an audience. It just works, quietly, without fanfare. And then he offers a striking image. Movement overcomes cold. Stillness overcomes heat. He argues that stillness and tranquility set things in order under heaven. So what's the lesson? Stop judging by appearances. The person who seems the most put together might be the most hollow, and the one who seems rough, unfinished, even awkward, might carry more substance than everyone around them. Lao Tzu was telling you that the Tao doesn't look impressive. It never will. And that's exactly why most people walk right past it. They're too busy chasing what shines. But what shines wears out. What seems incomplete endures. The key lesson is stark. Stop worshiping the surface. What's real will never look the way you expect it to. Verse 46 is Lao Tzu drawing a line between a society at peace and a society at war. And that line, it's desire. He paints two pictures. When the Tao is present in the world, horses plow the fields. When the Tao is forgotten, war horses are bred on the borders. It's a simple image, but the meaning runs deep. A world in harmony uses its energy to grow. A world out of balance uses its energy to destroy. And then Lao Tzu names it plainly. He says there is no greater disaster than not knowing what is enough. No greater curse than the desire to possess more. These aren't soft suggestions. He's calling unchecked desire a sickness, a rot that eats through individuals and civilizations alike. Here's the thing most people miss. He's not talking about ambition. He's not telling you to stop working, stop building, stop creating. He's talking about the kind of wanting that never stops. The kind where you get what you wanted and immediately want the next thing. That hollow loop. Lao Tzu argues that true contentment comes from knowing when enough is enough. Not from getting more, not from having everything, just recognizing the moment where you already have what you need and resting there. Verse 47 sounds extreme at first, almost arrogant, but sit with it and it opens up. Lao Tzu says you can know the whole world without stepping outside your door. You can understand the way of heaven without looking out your window. And the further you travel, the less you actually know. That sounds absurd, right? but he's not talking about geography. He's not saying travel is pointless or that information is useless. He's making a distinction between knowledge and understanding. You can read 1,000 books about life and still not understand yourself. You can visit every country on Earth and never once sit still long enough to see what's right in front of you. That's his point. External seeking without internal clarity just creates noise. Lao Tzu argues that the sage knows without going, sees without looking, accomplishes without forcing action. And that's because the sage has turned inward. He understands the patterns, the nature of things, not through data, but through awareness. This verse isn't anti-intellectual, it's anti-distraction. It's a warning that running around collecting experiences and information can become its own form of avoidance. Sometimes the deepest knowing doesn't come from looking harder. It comes from getting quiet enough to finally see what was always there. Verse 48 is one of the most important chapters in the Tao Te Ching, and it starts with a line that should stop you in your tracks. Lao Tzu says, "In the pursuit of learning, every day something is gained. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is dropped." Read that again. He's not against learning, but he's saying there's a completely different path, one that doesn't add, one that subtracts. You drop opinions, you drop assumptions, and you keep dropping until you arrive at a state he calls wu wei, non-action. And then comes the real gut punch. He says, when nothing is done, nothing is left undone. That's not laziness, that's alignment. It means when you stop forcing outcomes, when you stop micromanaging reality, things begin to unfold the way they're supposed to. Not because you did nothing, but because you stopped interfering. Lao Tzu argues that the world is not won by those who grab at it. He says, try to control it and you'll lose it, every time. This is the core of his philosophy, stripped bare. Stop accumulating. Stop overcomplicating. Stop adding layers of effort where none are needed. The mastery isn't in doing more, it's in needing to do less. Verse 49 is about something most people claim to do, but almost nobody actually does: openness. Lao Tzu says the sage has no fixed mind, no rigid opinions, no permanent position. Instead, the sage takes the mind of the people as his own. He makes their concerns his concerns, their reality his reality. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. He says the sage is good to those who are good, and also good to those who are not good. He trusts those who are trustworthy, and also trusts those who are not trustworthy. That's how true goodness works. That's how true trust works. Most people hear that and resist immediately. Why would you trust someone who's proven untrustworthy? But Lao Tzu isn't being naive. He's making a deeper point. The sage doesn't adjust his character based on other people's behavior. He doesn't let the world dictate who he becomes. His goodness isn't a reaction, it's a foundation. And there's a result to this. He says the sage draws all people toward him. They look to him, listen to him, not because he demands attention, but because he treats everyone, without exception, with the same open heart. The lesson here is sharp. Your character shouldn't be conditional. If your kindness depends on who's receiving it, it was never really kindness. Verse 50 deals with something nobody likes to think about: death. Lao Tzu observes a strange pattern. Out of every 10 people, 3 are devoted to life, 3 are devoted to death, and 3 more are simply moving from life to death by how recklessly they live. That's 9 out of 10. nearly everyone. But there's a 10th, someone who knows how to live so fully, so aligned with the Tao, that death finds no grip on them. Lao Tzu says this person can walk through the wild without being attacked by tigers or rhinoceros, can enter a battle without needing armor or weapons. The horn finds no place to pierce, the claw finds no place to tear, the blade finds no place to cut. Now, he's not talking about literal invincibility. He's not saying you'll dodge bullets. He's saying something subtler. When you stop clinging to life out of fear and stop rushing toward death out of recklessness, you enter a different state. You move through the world without resistance, without the kind of tension that attracts destruction. Lao Tzu's point is paradoxical, and he knows it. The person who isn't obsessed with survival is the one who truly lives. The lesson? Stop gripping life so tightly. Fear of death doesn't protect you, it consumes you. Verse 51 gets to the very heart of how the Tao actually works in the world. Lao Tzu breaks it down simply. The Tao gives birth to all things. Virtue, what he calls Te, nourishes them. Matter gives them form, and their environment shapes them into completion. Everything you see around you exists because of this process. And because of this, he says all things naturally honor the Tao and value virtue. But here's the critical part. Not because they're commanded to, not because there's a law, not because someone's enforcing it. It happens on its own, spontaneously, organically. This is Lao Tzu drawing a clear line between authority and control. The Tao produces, but doesn't possess. It acts, but doesn't expect anything in return. It guides, but never dominates. He calls this the primal virtue, the deepest kind of power there is, and the implications are enormous. He's describing a model of creation that never asks for credit, never demands worship, never holds what it made on a leash. It gives and then lets go, completely. The lesson cuts straight to the bone. Real power doesn't control. It cultivates, it nurtures, and then it steps back. If you're clinging to what you've created, whether it's people, projects, or outcomes, you haven't understood the Tao at all. Lao Tzu says everything has a beginning, a mother, a source, and once you find the source, you understand everything that came from it. Once you understand the children, you return to the mother, and in that return, you're safe, no matter what happens, for the rest of your life. He then gives very specific advice. Close your mouth, shut the doors of your senses, and your life will be full of ease. But open your mouth, busy yourself with endless affairs, and nothing can save you. That sounds extreme, but Lao Tzu isn't telling you to become a hermit. He's saying, stop leaking energy. Stop scattering your attention across 1,000 distractions. The more noise you let in, the more drained you become. The more you chase the external, the further you drift from what actually sustains you. He argues that seeing the small is clarity, keeping to softness is real strength. Use the outer light, but return to the inner light, and you won't invite disaster into your life. The lesson? The world pulls you outward, constantly, relentlessly. But wisdom is the opposite movement. It pulls you inward, back to the root, back to the source. Lao Tzu is saying, the way home isn't forward, it's back to where you started, before the noise took over. Lao Tzu paints a sharp picture here. He says if he had even a small amount of wisdom, he would walk the great path, the Tao, and his only fear would be straying from it. The great path is broad, easy, smooth, but people love shortcuts. They love side roads. and that's where they get lost. And then he describes what that straying looks like. The courts are lavish, the fields are full of weeds, the granaries are empty, but the rulers wear fine clothes, they carry sharp swords, they gorge on food and drink, they hoard wealth beyond what they could ever use. Lao Tzu calls this robbery, not leadership. Robbery. And he says it's the opposite of the Tao. This verse is direct and almost angry. He's pointing at a world where those in power live in excess, while the people they're supposed to serve go hungry. The fields are neglected. The real work isn't being done, but the surface looks polished, impressive, decorated. The lesson hits close to home, even now. Whenever appearance gets more attention than substance, you've left the path. Whenever comfort is hoarded at the top while the foundation crumbles, that's not leadership, that's theft. Lao Tzu doesn't mince words here, and he doesn't need to. Lao Tzu shifts to something constructive here. He says, "What is well planted cannot be uprooted. What is firmly held cannot slip away. And when this principle is honored, generation after generation carries it forward." He then maps it outward. Cultivate the Tao in yourself, and your virtue becomes real. Cultivate it in your family, and virtue overflows. Cultivate it in your community, and virtue grows. Cultivate it in your nation, and virtue becomes abundant. Cultivate it across the world, and virtue becomes universal. So, how do you understand a family? By looking at your own. How do you understand a nation? Through your own. How do you understand the world? Through itself. And how does Lao Tzu know all this? Through exactly this kind of observation. The lesson here is deeply practical. Change doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with you, personally, quietly. What you build inside yourself radiates outward, not through preaching, not through forcing your values on others, but through embodiment, through practice. Lao Tzu is saying, you want to change the world? Start with your own roots. Make them deep, make them honest, make them unshakable. Because what is truly rooted doesn't need to fight to survive. It simply endures, and everything else grows from it. Lao Tzu uses a striking image here. He compares the person filled with deep virtue to a newborn baby. And it's not a sentimental comparison, it's a precise one. A baby, he points out, is soft, flexible. Its bones are weak, its muscles tender, and yet its grip is strong. It can cry all day without going hoarse. It moves without tension. It acts without thinking about acting. It doesn't know about the union of male and female, and yet its vital energy is fully intact. That, Lao Tzu says, is perfect harmony. He's not telling you to become helpless. He's pointing at something most adults have completely lost: the ability to exist without forcing, without straining, without burning through your own energy trying to control everything around you. And then comes the warning. He says when things try to be strong too early, they grow old too fast. When you force growth, you accelerate decay. Whatever goes against the Tao comes to an early end. This is aimed directly at the people who pride themselves on being tough, on pushing harder, on never resting. Lao Tzu says, look at a baby. It doesn't try, and it overflows with life. The key lesson? Softness isn't fragility, it's the purest form of vitality there is. Lao Tzu drops one of his most quoted lines here. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. And right away, that stings, because most people do the exact opposite. The more someone thinks they understand, the more they talk, the more they explain, the more they broadcast. But Lao Tzu says real understanding moves in the other direction, toward silence, toward restraint. He then describes what this looks like in practice. Close your mouth, guard your senses, blunt your sharpness, untangle your complications, soften your glare, settle into the dust with everyone else. He calls this the mysterious unity. And here's what's interesting. The person who reaches this state, Lao Tzu says, can't be swayed. You can't get close enough to manipulate them. You can't push them away either. You can't bribe them with praise. You can't wound them with insults. They're beyond all of it. That's why, he argues, this person is the most respected under heaven, not because they demanded respect, but because they became untouchable, not through armor, but through stillness. The key lesson? Wisdom doesn't need to announce itself. The loudest person in the room rarely knows the most, and the one who says nothing, pay close attention to that one. Lao Tzu turns his attention to leadership here, and his argument is uncomfortable for anyone who believes control equals order. He starts with a distinction. Rule a country with justice, fine. Wage a war with strategy, fine. But win the world? You do that by letting go, by stepping back, by not interfering. And then he lays out the evidence. The more rules a government creates, the poorer the people become. The more weapons a nation stockpiles, the more chaos spreads. The more clever and cunning people get, the more strange and twisted things appear. The more laws you write, the more criminals you produce. Read that again. He's saying the tools meant to create order are the very things creating disorder. So what does Lao Tzu propose instead? He puts it in the voice of the sage. I take no action, and people transform on their own. I love stillness, and people correct themselves. I stay out of the way, and people prosper. I desire nothing, and people return to simplicity. This isn't laziness, it's trust. Trust in people, trust in the natural order of things, and a deep suspicion of anyone who thinks more control is always the answer. The key lesson? The best leader doesn't micromanage the world into shape. They create the space for things to find their own balance. Verse 58 opens with one of Lao Tzu's sharpest political observations, and it hasn't aged a day. When the government is dull and inactive, he says, the people are happy and prosperous. When the government is sharp and intrusive, the people are cunning and dissatisfied. Simple as that. He's not advocating for chaos or the absence of order. He's pointing out something most leaders refuse to accept. The tighter you control people, the more they resist. The more rules you impose, the more loopholes people find. Overreach doesn't create obedience. It creates resentment. But then Lao Tzu goes deeper. He observes that misfortune and fortune lean on each other. Disaster hides within blessing, blessing hides within disaster, and no one knows where the turning point is. This isn't pessimism, it's pattern recognition. What looks like victory today may contain the seeds of tomorrow's failure. What feels like a setback right now may be redirecting you towards something better. Lao Tzu says certainty is an illusion. Things keep reversing. They always have. The key lesson? Stop labeling everything as purely good or purely bad. Life doesn't work in straight lines. It spirals. And the wise person, Lao Tzu argues, stays sharp without cutting, stays pointed without piercing, present, aware, but never rigid. Verse 59 is about conservation, not of resources, of yourself. Lao Tzu uses a phrase here that gets translated in many ways, but the core idea is this: in governing people and serving heaven, nothing compares to restraint. He calls it storing up virtue early, and that phrase deserves attention. What does it mean to store up virtue early? It means you don't wait until crisis hits to start practicing discipline. You build reserves of patience, of character, of inner strength long before you need them, not when the storm arrives, before it.
He compares this to having deep roots. A tree with deep roots can endure any wind. A person who has quietly accumulated inner virtue over time can weather anything life throws at them, not because they're invincible, because they're grounded. Lao Tzu then connects this to leadership. A ruler who practices restraint, he says, can endure long, can govern without exhaustion, can sustain a kingdom or a life without burning it to the ground. The key lesson here is almost too practical for a philosophy book, but that's what makes it land. Don't spend everything you have, energy, emotion, attention, the moment you get it. Hold something back. Build depth before you build height, because height without depth is just a long way to fall. Verse 60 contains what might be the most quoted line in the entire Tao Te Ching, and it's about cooking. Governing a great nation, Lao Tzu says, is like cooking a small fish. You don't poke it, you don't flip it constantly, you don't prod and interfere, you let it be. Handle it too much, and it falls apart. That's it. That's the governing philosophy, and it applies far beyond politics. Lao Tzu is making a broader point about interference. Whether you're running a country, managing a team, or raising a family, constant meddling destroys the very thing you're trying to nurture. People need space. Projects need breathing room. Not everything requires your input at every moment. He then adds a layer that often gets overlooked. When the Tao is present in governance, he says, even dark forces lose that power. Not because they're destroyed, because they simply have nothing to feed on. When a leader governs with lightness and alignment, negativity has no foothold. The key lesson is both ancient and urgent. Stop over-touching things. Stop micromanaging outcomes. The impulse to constantly adjust, correct, and control doesn't come from wisdom. It comes from anxiety. Lao Tzu says the best kind of authority is barely felt. It holds things together precisely because it doesn't squeeze. Lao Tzu uses a striking image here. He compares a great nation to a low-lying river delta, the place where all streams naturally flow. Everything moves downward toward it, not because it demands anything, because it sits below. And then he applies this to power. He argues that a great country should place itself beneath smaller countries, not out of weakness, out of strategy, out of wisdom. By being humble, by yielding, the larger nation wins trust. It draws others in without force, without threats, without domination. He extends this both ways. The large country gains influence by lowering itself. The small country gains protection by submitting with grace. Both benefit, but only when the greater power takes the lower position first. That's the key. The burden of humility falls on the one with more strength, not less. This verse is deeply political, but the personal lesson hits just as hard. Lao Tzu is saying, if you want people to come to you, stop towering over them. Stop asserting dominance. The rivers don't flow uphill, they flow down, toward the lowest point. And that's the paradox he keeps returning to. The one who lowers themselves rises. The one who serves leads, not through cleverness, through gravity, through the natural pull of genuine humility. Lao Tzu calls the Tao a treasure in this verse, not a treasure for the worthy, a treasure for everyone, including those the world has written off. He says the Tao is the refuge of the good
and the protection of the bad. That's a hard line for most people to accept. We want goodness rewarded and wickedness punished. Clean categories. But Lao Tzu refuses that framework. He argues the Tao doesn't discriminate. It doesn't pick favorites. It shelters all things equally, the saint and the sinner alike. Then he makes a sharp observation. He says, beautiful words can be traded in the marketplace. Noble deeds can earn respect. But even people who aren't good, why should they be abandoned? The Tao doesn't abandon them, so why do we? He even challenges the value of worldly ceremonies. When a new emperor is crowned and officials present jade and horses, Lao Tzu says it would be better to sit still and offer the Tao instead. No spectacle, no performance, just the truth. The lesson here cuts deep. Lao Tzu is arguing that no one is beyond the reach of the Tao. No one is too broken. No one is too lost. The Tao doesn't judge your resume. It doesn't check your record. It simply remains open, available, and waiting for anyone willing to return. Lao Tzu opens this verse with a sequence that sounds impossible. Act without acting. Work without effort. Taste without tasting. He's not being mystical for the sake of it. He's pointing at a way of living that most people never consider. His argument is this: deal with things before they become problems. Handle what's difficult while it's still easy. Address what's large while it's still small. Every massive struggle in life once started as something tiny, something manageable, something you could have resolved with a calm hand if you'd been paying attention. He warns against making promises lightly. The person who says yes to everything too easily will inevitably break their word. And the person who treats everything as simple will eventually be crushed by difficulty. That's not pessimism. That's observation. But then comes the turn. Lao Tzu says the sage sees difficulty in everything, and because of that, never actually encounters it. Not because problems disappear, because they're handled before they grow teeth. The core lesson here is about prevention, not reaction. Most people wait until the fire is burning. Lao Tzu says, notice the heat when it's still just warm. Respond to the whisper before it becomes a scream. That's not avoidance, that's mastery. Real control isn't dramatic, it's quiet, almost invisible. Lao Tzu opens this verse with pure pragmatism. What is at rest is easy to hold. What hasn't started is easy to plan for. What is fragile is easy to break. What is small is easy to scatter. His point? Deal with things before they become problems. Act while things are still manageable. Don't wait for the crisis, because by then, your options have already narrowed. He uses images that are impossible to forget. A tree that fills your arms grew from a tiny sprout. A tower 9 stories high started with a single pile of earth. A journey of 1,000 miles began with one step under your foot. But then he turns the lens inward. He says people often ruin things right at the finish line. They work hard, stay disciplined, and then lose focus at the very end, so close to completion, and they throw it away. Lao Tzu warns, be as careful at the end as you were at the beginning. That's where most failures happen. And here's what separates this from simple productivity advice. Lao Tzu adds that the sage desires to have no desires, doesn't cling to outcomes, doesn't hoard achievements. He learns to unlearn. He helps things find their natural course without forcing. That's the difference between controlling and guiding. Lao Tzu says something here that sounds controversial at first. He argues that in ancient times, those who practiced the Tao didn't try to enlighten the people, they kept them simple. Now, before you react to that, Understand what he's actually saying. He's not promoting ignorance. He's warning against cleverness. There's a difference. He argues that when people become overly clever, overly strategic, overly calculating, they become harder to govern, not because intelligence is bad, but because cunning replaces sincerity, scheming replaces trust. People start gaming every system instead of living within it honestly. Lao Tzu draws a clean line. Ruling a country with cleverness is a curse upon it. Ruling without cleverness is a blessing. That's his measure. Not intelligence versus stupidity, but manipulation versus simplicity. And then he points at something deeper. He calls this understanding the primal virtue, knowing the difference between artificial complexity and natural simplicity. Primal virtue runs deep, it runs far, and it leads all things back to harmony. The lesson here is uncomfortable, but honest. The more sophisticated we make things, our systems, our strategies, our thinking, the further we drift from what actually works. Lao Tzu doesn't trust complexity. He trusts what's natural, what's uncomplicated, what doesn't need an instruction manual. Lao Tzu asks a simple question here. Why do all rivers and streams flow to the sea? His answer is direct, because the sea lies below them. It stays lower. It doesn't compete. It doesn't reach upward. It simply rests beneath everything else. And because of that, everything flows toward it naturally. He then turns this into a lesson about leadership. If you want to lead people, he argues, you must place yourself beneath them with your words. If you want to guide them, you must put yourself behind them, not in front, not above. This is Lao Tzu's formula. The sage leads by standing behind, rules by lowering themselves. And because of this, when they rise to the top, people don't feel burdened. When they walk ahead, people don't feel threatened. The world supports them gladly, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because they don't compete. And because they don't compete, no one can compete with them. That last line is the sharpest one. Lao Tzu isn't saying ambition is wrong. He's saying the method matters. The person who climbs over others will always be pulled down. But the person who lifts others up, they're carried higher than they ever could have climbed alone. That's not weakness. That's strategy rooted in nature itself. Lao Tzu says the whole world calls his teaching great, but also strange, almost useless. And he doesn't argue with that. He says it's precisely because it's great that it seems odd. If it looked ordinary, it would have disappeared long ago. But then he reveals something. He says he has 3 treasures, 3 things he guards and holds close. The first, compassion. The second, frugality. The third, never daring to be ahead of the world. And he's dead serious about all 3. He argues that compassion makes you courageous, not the other way around. Most people think courage comes from hardness. Lao Tzu says it comes from caring deeply. Frugality, not greed, not accumulation, makes you generous, because when you need less, you can give more. And refusing to put yourself first, that's what makes you a true leader. He warns that if you try to be courageous without compassion, you'll destroy yourself. If you try to be generous without frugality, you'll run dry. If you try to lead by pushing to the front, you'll fall. The key lesson is this. Lao Tzu's 3 treasures aren't glamorous. They don't look powerful on the surface. But he argues they're the foundation of everything that actually lasts. Tenderness, restraint, humility. These aren't weaknesses. They're the only real strengths. Lao Tzu turns to the nature of true strength here, and he strips away every illusion about it. He says, a good soldier is not violent. A good fighter is not angry. A good winner is not vengeful. A good leader puts themselves below the people they lead. Every single line is a contradiction to how the world operates. We celebrate aggression. We reward dominance. We admire people who crush their competition and stand over them.
Lao Tzu calls all of that weakness. He argues that the real power lies in what he calls the virtue of non-contention, not competing, not clashing, not needing to prove you're the strongest in the room. He says the person who can use others' strengths, who can bring people together without ego, that person holds something ancient, something aligned with the deepest pattern of existence. He's not talking about being passive. He's talking about being so grounded that you don't need conflict to validate yourself. The key lesson? Lao Tzu argues that mastery, real mastery, is quiet. The best warrior doesn't want war. The best leader doesn't need the spotlight. And the person who truly wins, they never made it a fight in the first place. Dominance through force isn't strength. It's a confession of insecurity. Real power has nothing to prove. Lao Tzu addresses warfare here, but the principle goes far beyond the battlefield. He says there's a saying among strategists, "I dare not be the host. I'd rather be the guest. I dare not advance an inch. I'd rather retreat a foot." What does that mean? It means the one who initiates, who attacks, who pushes forward aggressively, is already at a disadvantage. The one who yields, who waits, who responds rather than reacts, that's the one who survives. He calls this marching without marching, rolling up your sleeves without baring your arms, holding a weapon that seems invisible, confronting an enemy without a battle line. And then comes the warning. He says there is no greater disaster than underestimating your opponent. To take your enemy lightly is to almost lose your most precious treasure, everything you are. Lao Tzu argues that when two forces meet and they're evenly matched, the one who grieves, the one who fights with sorrow, not arrogance, will win. The key lesson is sharp. Never be the aggressor. Never assume you're superior. And if you must engage in conflict, do it with reluctance, not eagerness. Lao Tzu makes it clear. The one who enters a fight smiling has already misunderstood the cost. The one who enters grieving understands what's truly at stake. Verse 70 is one of the most personal moments in the entire Tao Te Ching, and it carries a weight that's hard to miss. Lao Tzu says his words are very easy to understand, very easy to practice, and yet no one in the world understands them. No one practices them. There's frustration here, maybe even loneliness. He's not being dramatic. He's stating a fact that every truthful teacher eventually faces. The simplest truths are the hardest to accept, not because they're complicated, but because people don't want simple. They want clever. They want complex strategies and hidden formulas. And when someone says, just let go, it sounds too easy, so they ignore it. Lao Tzu says his words have an ancestor, his actions have a master, meaning he's not making this up. There's something ancient behind what he's saying, something rooted, but because people don't understand that root, they don't understand him. And then he says something striking. He says, "Those who understand me are few, and that makes me precious." He's not bragging, he's making a sober observation. The sage wears rough clothes, but carries jade inside. The outside doesn't match the inside, and most people only see the outside. Truth doesn't shout. It rarely looks impressive. That's why most people walk right past it. Verse 71 is sharp. Just a few lines, but it cuts deep if you let it. Lao Tzu says, knowing that you don't know is the highest form of knowing. Not knowing that you don't know, that's a disease. He's not playing with words here. He's diagnosing something that ruins people.
The ones who think they've figured it all out, they stop growing, they stop listening. They become rigid, and rigidity in Lao Tzu's world is death. But the person who holds their knowledge lightly, who admits what they don't see, that person stays open, stays fluid, stays alive in a way that matters. And then Lao Tzu adds something interesting. He says, the sage is free from this disease because he recognizes it as a disease. That's it. That's the cure. Just seeing the pattern for what it is. Not some advanced technique, not years of study, just honest awareness of your own blind spots. This verse is a quiet demolition of arrogance. Not the loud kind, the subtle kind. The kind where you stop questioning yourself, where certainty becomes your identity. Lao Tzu warns that the moment you believe you have all the answers, you've already lost the most important one. Humility isn't weakness here, it's clarity. Verse 72 is about space and what happens when you take it away. Lao Tzu says, when people no longer fear your authority, something far greater and more dangerous is coming. He's warning rulers here directly. When you squeeze people too hard, when you leave them no room to breathe, to live, to be, they stop fearing you. And that's not peace. That's the edge of collapse. But then he turns the lens inward. He says, don't crowd your own life. Don't weary yourself with your own existence. If you don't tire of yourself, others won't tire of you either. That line deserves a pause. Most people exhaust themselves long before the world does, overthinking, overworking, overanalyzing every choice. Lao Tzu is saying, stop suffocating your own nature. Give yourself space. Let yourself be. He argues that the sage knows himself, but doesn't obsess over himself, cares for himself, but doesn't elevate himself above others. He chooses the inner over the outer. Substance over display. This is governance advice and life advice wrapped into one. Whether you're leading others or just leading yourself, the principle is the same. Press too hard and things break. People break. You break. The lightest grip holds the longest. Verse 73 is about courage, but not the kind you'd expect. Lao Tzu draws a sharp distinction. There's courage rooted in daring, reckless, aggressive, forceful, and there's courage rooted in restraint, patient, yielding, quiet. The first kind gets you killed. The second kind keeps you alive. And he doesn't sugarcoat it. He says even he can't fully explain why the Tao favors one over the other. Some things are just part of its nature. The Tao's net is vast. Its workings are subtle, but nothing, absolutely nothing, slips through. He describes the Tao's way of operating. It doesn't compete, yet it wins. It doesn't speak, yet it answers. It doesn't summon, yet things come to it on their own. It's unhurried, yet its plans are flawless. No aggression, no force, and still, nothing escapes it. This is Lao Tzu challenging a deeply held belief that boldness and aggression are the highest forms of strength. He says no. The universe itself doesn't operate that way. It moves slowly, quietly, without confrontation, and yet everything falls into place. The lesson here hits hard. The person who charges forward isn't brave, they're reckless. Real courage is knowing when to hold back, when to wait, when to let the situation resolve without your fist in it. Verse 74 turns political, and it's ruthless. Lao Tzu poses a direct question. If people aren't afraid of death, what good is threatening them with it?
This one line dismantles entire systems of governance built on fear and punishment. He says when people are crushed, taxed beyond endurance, oppressed beyond hope, stripped of meaning, death stops being a threat. It starts looking like relief.
And at that point, every weapon the state holds becomes useless. You can't control someone who has nothing left to lose. But he goes further. He warns against anyone who takes it upon themselves to execute punishment in place of the natural order. He compares it to an amateur trying to do the work of a master carpenter. Pick up that axe without skill, and you'll cut your own hand. Lao Tzu is saying something specific here. Punishment is not your domain. Life and death follow their own rhythm, the rhythm of the Tao. When rulers try to play executioner, when they believe fear is the ultimate lever of control, they always end up destroying themselves. The lesson is uncomfortable for anyone in power. You cannot govern through terror. People who no longer fear death are beyond your reach, and trying to wield that kind of authority will only turn the blade back on you. Verse 75 stays in political territory, but this time Lao Tzu names the disease directly: greed. Specifically, the greed of those in charge. He says the people are starving. Why? Because their rulers consume too much in taxes. The people are difficult to govern. Why? Because their rulers interfere too much. The people treat death lightly. Why? Because their rulers demand so much from life that living itself becomes unbearable. 3 problems, 1 cause: leadership that takes more than it gives. And notice, Lao Tzu doesn't blame the people, not once. He doesn't call them lazy, doesn't call them ungrateful or rebellious. He points the finger upward, every time. The dysfunction flows from the top down. When those in power are excessive, those beneath them suffer. Period. He then makes a quiet but devastating comparison. Those who don't cling to life, who live simply without excess, are actually wiser than those who obsess over accumulating more. The ruler who hoards is the one truly in danger, not the peasant who has nothing. Lao Tzu's message here hasn't aged a single day. Societies don't collapse because ordinary people fail. They collapse because those at the top take too much and give back too little. The lesson? If people are suffering, look at who's leading them. The answer is almost always there. Lao Tzu draws a line between life and death here, and it's not where you'd expect. He says, when people are born, they're soft, flexible, tender. When they die, they're stiff, rigid, hard. Same with plants. A living branch bends, a dead one snaps. So he arrives at a blunt conclusion. The hard and rigid belong to death. The soft and yielding belong to life. He then applies this to power. A mighty army that refuses to bend will be broken. A tree that stands stiff against the wind will be uprooted. The hard and strong fall. The soft and weak rise. Now, this goes against almost everything modern culture teaches. We admire toughness. We celebrate people who refuse to bend. We glorify the unbreakable. But Lao Tzu says that's exactly where destruction begins. Rigidity isn't strength, it's a death sentence wearing a mask. The lesson is sharp. Stay soft, not because you're weak, because you want to survive. The things that endure in this world aren't the hardest, they're the most adaptable. Water outlasts rock. Grass survives the storm that topples the oak. Lao Tzu keeps hammering this point throughout the entire text. Flexibility isn't a compromise, it's a survival strategy. And the refusal to bend is just a slower way of breaking. Lao Tzu uses a simple image here. The Tao of heaven is like drawing a bow. What's too high gets pulled down, what's too low gets raised up. What has too much gets reduced, what doesn't have enough gets added to. Heaven's way is balance, constant automatic correction. But then he flips it. The way of people? Completely opposite. People take from those who have too little and give to those who already have too much. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and nobody calls it what it is. So who follows the way of heaven? Lao Tzu says, only the one who has the Tao. The sage acts but doesn't take credit, accomplishes great things but doesn't dwell on them, doesn't want to display his own worth. He simply gives without keeping score. The lesson here stings because it describes a pattern we all recognize: systems that reward excess and punish scarcity, people who hoard what they don't need while others go without. Lao Tzu isn't just philosophizing, he's diagnosing. And his prescription is simple: give where there's lack, take from where there's surplus. Not for applause, not for legacy, just because that's how the universe is supposed to work. And we've been working against it.
Lao Tzu returns to water one last time, and he makes his case plainly. Nothing in the world is softer or weaker than water, but nothing is better at overcoming the hard and strong. Nothing can replace it. Nothing can match it. The soft overcomes the hard. The weak overcomes the strong. Everyone knows this. He says it clearly. Everyone knows it, but no one puts it into practice.
And that's the real tragedy Lao Tzu is pointing at. This isn't hidden knowledge, it's obvious. Water wears down stone. Patience outlasts aggression. Gentleness dismantles resistance. We see it, we understand it, and still we choose force. We choose hardness every single time. He then says something that sounds strange. The one who takes on the filth of the nation, that person is fit to lead it. The one who bears the misfortune of the people, that one is the true ruler. He calls these words true but paradoxical. The lesson is devastating in its simplicity. Real leadership looks like service. Real strength looks like yielding. And the greatest truth about power is one that almost nobody is willing to live by. Lao Tzu doesn't expect you to agree easily. He just expects you to notice. You already know this. You've just been ignoring it. Lao Tzu addresses something every person has dealt with: conflict, grudges, the lingering bitterness that stays even after a dispute is supposedly resolved. He says, when a great resentment is settled, some resentment always remains. And he asks a hard question. How can that be considered good? How can you call that resolution when the wound is still there, just beneath the surface? His answer is unexpected. The sage, he says, keeps his end of the bargain and doesn't demand anything from the other side. The person of virtue fulfills their obligation. The person without virtue spends all their time trying to collect what they're owed. That's a gut punch, because most people operate on scorekeeping. Someone wrongs you, they owe you. Someone breaks a promise, you hold it over them. And Lao Tzu says that's exactly what keeps the cycle alive. That need to be repaid. That refusal to absorb the loss and move forward. He then adds something critical. The Tao of heaven has no favorites. It doesn't take sides, but it consistently supports the person who is good, not the one who is right, not the one who is wronged, the one who is good. The key lesson? You can win the argument and still lose the peace. Let go of what's owed. That's where real resolution lives. This verse reads almost like a dream.
Lao Tzu paints a picture of a small country, few people, simple tools, most of which are never even used. People who take death seriously and don't travel far from home.
There are boats and carriages, but no one rides them. There are weapons, but no one displays them. People go back to tying knots instead of writing. They enjoy their food. They feel comfortable in their clothing. They're content in their homes. They take pleasure in their customs.
Neighboring countries are so close. You can hear the roosters crowing and the dogs barking across the border. And yet, the people grow old and die without ever feeling the need to visit. Now, is Lao Tzu literally proposing this as a political model? Not quite. He's making a deeper point. He's holding up a mirror to the restlessness that drives civilization, the constant need for more progress, more expansion, more stimulation. And he's asking, what if none of that actually makes people happy? What if contentment has nothing to do with having more and everything to do with needing less? The key lesson? Simplicity isn't backwardness. It's a kind of freedom most people have forgotten even exists. The last verse of the Tao Te Ching. And Lao Tzu doesn't end with a grand speech. He ends with quiet clarity. True words are not beautiful, he says. Beautiful words are not true. The good do not argue. Those who argue are not good. The wise are not learned. The learned are not wise. 3 clean cuts, and each one dismantles something society worships: eloquence, debate, and education. Not by rejecting them, but by exposing how often they're mistaken for the real thing. He then describes the sage one last time. The sage doesn't hoard. The more he gives to others, the more he has. The more he does for others, the greater he becomes. He accumulates nothing for himself, and somehow ends up with everything. And then the final line, the Tao of heaven benefits and does not harm. The way of the sage is to act without competing. That's it. No dramatic conclusion, no call to action, just a quiet reminder that the highest way of living isn't about accumulating, it's about giving. It isn't about winning, it's about serving without needing anything in return. The key lesson? This is Lao Tzu's parting truth. The universe operates on generosity, and the person who understands that, truly understands it, will never lack a thing.